Okay, this week we're going to look at a couple of examples of archaeologists employing some of the techniques that we looked at last week in bioarchaeology and human osteology in order to answer questions about ancient societies. And then we're going to move on to a related field, and that is mortuary analysis. Whereas human osteology focuses on the biological aspects of human societies and humans by looking at the skeleton, mortuary analysis looks at some of the cultural behaviors involved in burial and what they can tell us about ancient belief systems and ancient religion and things like that. Okay, so let's look at first the site of Crow Creek. This was a site in the Midwest United States that was excavated by archaeologists. It dates to about the 1300s. During European contact, Native Americans, later on, in the 1800s, were hunting bison in this area. But in the 1300s, they were settled agriculturalists, and the site of Crow Creek was right on this bluff overlooking the river. It was actually kind of a strategically located site. There was, it looked like, a sheer drop on three sides, or these sides right here, and then over here, the people who lived in Crow Creek looked like they were building an earthen wall, but never finished it. Now, related to that was what they found inside of the site. They found a mass burial of 500 people. Looked like they were victims of a massacre. You can see that this is not a orderly laid out cemetery or graves or series of graves. This is one mass burial. This is one event, not a series of events. So it looked like 500 people were killed during a massacre and then thrown into this pit, mostly women and children. Now, archaeologists decided that they were going to look at the bones in more detail and try and see if that could tell them what might have been going on and why this massacre may have occurred. One thing that they were able to tell from looking at climate data was that this was a period of drought in the area. They could also look at the evidence and see that the massacre probably happened in late autumn or early winter. The village was burned. The ditch and the fortification was never finished. And so there was probably an attack. This massacre occurred during an attack before that fortification could be finished, because men were not really a lot of the victims. It probably occurred when the men were out of the village. And so it was probably from another village where it was an ambush. They waited till the men had left that village, and then they attacked and they massacred the women and children. This was not a war of conquest. It looked like it was a war of extermination. Right? They were basically trying to get rid of these people. So why did it occur? Did it have anything to do with the drought? What could we tell? Well, it looked like up to this period, this was a period of growth. Many villages popped up along the river, right, based on agriculture. So when they looked at the skeletons, what they found was that there was many pieces of evidence showing nutritional stress as this drought started to occur. Right? Iron deficiency produces anemia. Anemia can usually be seen, as we talked about before, as orbital criba, right? These little pockmarks on the top of the orbits. The x-rays also showed Harris lines. There was also evidence of scurvy. So it looked like these people in general, the people who were killed, were pretty malnourished. There was also post-mortem trauma, right? This is trauma that doesn't look like it healed, right? And it was soon after death, right? So around the time of death, because it doesn't look like it occurred way after the bones had been already buried. And what you see is evidence of scalping. So cut marks on the tops of the skulls. You know, this was a practice in some Native American communities to disfigure your enemy. That way they had to live sort of in the afterlife disfigured. Also, scalping was, you know, partly for taking trophies. But the practice became, you know, was adopted by white settlers during colonial days as well. And the trophy taking was sort of exacerbated by early wars between colonists and Native Americans in North America. Right? So in general, what you might say is it looks like the conflict probably was over resources. That as the drought sort of took its toll, people started to have more and more nutritional stress, and that might have led to one village attacking another village, basically trying to get rid of those people so that they would have more resources for their own village. Okay, so that's one example where the understanding of the skeletons and the added information about nutritional stress kind of helps us propose a good hypothesis to explain why this massacre occurred. Okay, let's look at another study. This was done on a plantation in Florida during Spanish colonialism, where they also found Native American remains dating to the time period before colonialism. All right, so before the Spanish contact in around the 1500s. So what was the health of Native Americans like before and during contact with the Spanish as part of the Spanish Empire? Well, as we talked about before, one of the things that you can use bones, human bones for, and also animal bones, you can do stable isotope analysis. We talked about when we looked at archaeometry, you could look at stable carbon and stable nitrogen isotopes. And these isotopes will let you understand what the diet was like. If it was one that was based on marine animals, if it was based on different kinds of plants, or if it was focused more on maize or corn. And what you can see here, right, prehistoric, these are all before the mission period, which is the period of contact when Spaniards arrive, right? What you can see is that during the mission period, when there are Spaniards there, the diet of the Native Americans becomes heavily based on corn. And that's not a good thing. It looked like they had a more diverse diet early on, and then it became a much more narrowly focused diet on maize. What else can we tell? Well, the bones also give us an indication that the health of the people declined during the mission period. There's signs of infection, right? So you can see these lesions on the long bones. Arthritis, right? You know what a normal vertebrae looks like? A normal vertebrae doesn't have these gross-looking protrusions. This is all scar tissue. This is all bony deposits from arthritis, because it's called lipping on the vertebrae, because all of the cartilage in between the vertebrae was worn down through heavy work. The bone rubbed up against bone and produced scar tissue on the vertebrae. This person had to have been in some pain, as you might guess. There's also what's known as another kind of arthritis known as joint polish. Here, in the joints of the wrist, again, through all that heavy labor during the mission period, bone rubbed up against bone and actually produced polish on the bone. Obviously, we need cartilage in between our bones. Without the cartilage, bone rubbing up against bone is rather painful. They also could see, based on the diet switch to maize, like corn gruel, a lot of that was ground with grinding stones, but it's a very soft, starchy diet, and it led to cavities and plaque So in terms of the dentition, people's health was declining as well. And there's something similar to Harris lines, those lines that you could see we talked about in x-rays. Something similar to those occurs also on the teeth. You actually will have lines of growth interruption on the teeth. That's something that they noticed on skeletons from the mission period, again showing malnutrition. There were also lesions on the skull from infection and cavities. You can see some of those cavities as well, and some of those areas of interruption of growth on the enamel. Looking at the bones, the cross-section of the bones, they could see that the bones became thicker through time when they actually did a cross-section, showing that there were more muscle attachments there through the heavy labor. So overall, what can we tell? Well, before contact, the diet was more diverse among Native Americans. Their health seemed to be good. There was less disease and less of a abusive sort of workload where their skeleton is really paying the price. During the mission period, their diet declined, their dentition declined, their skeleton declined because of all the heavy workload, and so it became very, very disastrous, obviously, for the Native American communities. Okay, related to this, now we're going to look at mortuary analysis, how you actually incorporate some of the cultural aspects of burial, such as grave goods, position of the body, things like that. And this is related to your cemetery project. You're not only looking at the health of the people, that is, what age they died, that's something you are looking at, but you're also looking at some of the cultural aspects as well, such as how they were treated, how large their headstone was, ethnic diversity, iconography to tell us a little bit about belief systems, right? That is there greater religious iconography earlier on, later on, in sort of the middle? Is it consistent through time? Those are things that you're going to be able to look at, right? As well as health. Now, when you work on this project, again, to sort of remind you, you're going to follow that outline that I had, where you're going to have sort of an abstract, and I'll try and post this again in another video to make it clearer again, but you'll have an abstract summarizing the project. You'll have an intro where you're going to talk about the local history of the community around the cemetery, methods where you'll talk about your sampling strategy, results where you're going to present your data, and then discussion and conclusions you can group together. All right, so let's look at mortuary analysis. So mortuary analysis is focused on the cultural aspects. Are there differences between individuals in terms of how they're treated in burial? What are those differences based on? Are they based on age? Are they based on gender? Are they based on social status? Are they based on occupation? These are all possibilities in ancient communities. How people are treated in death correlates, many archaeologists believe, to how people are perceived during life, although there's not always a one-to-one correlation, right? So we can, as we're going to see, there might be communities where people are treated relatively the same in death, in their mortuary treatment, but in life there was a hierarchy. We just don't see that hierarchy in the cemetery. However, for many communities, the view of that person or that class or that group can be expressed in how they're treated in death, right? So that includes social organization, wealth, status, and also religious belief. Okay, Louis Binford, hopefully you remember his name, who came up with middle range theory and the new archaeology. Working with another archaeologist, they kind of came up with things that archaeologists could look for in analyzing mortuary remains from a community. And they sort of stated that the difference, and the differentiation according to an individual in death was linked to the position he or she occupied in the community during life, right? That is, if they had a very high status in the community when they were alive, that should be expressed in their mortuary remains. If they had a low status or even an outcast or pariah, that should be expressed in their mortuary remains. And as we're going to see, many times it is, but not always. And so we can't necessarily assume this is the way people are treated in ancient times. Who is burying an individual? The community. And the community is making the decisions as to how that person is going to be treated. So, if we look at cemeteries and burials from an ancient society, from the cemetery, can we determine if a society was ranked? Were there nobles? Were there big men? Were there people who had more status than other people? Were there differences based on gender? Were there differences based on occupation, like maybe warriors versus craft specialists? Was wealth inherited? Can we determine that? Was the society a complex one? That is, did it have a hierarchy that was fixed and permanent, like a chiefdom or a state? Right? And how can people be set apart from each other based on mortuary treatment? Right? Okay, well, we're going to take a look at that in the next video.